Oh, good. There we go. Thank you, thank you. Let's go ahead and get started here. And again, thank you so much for staying by this afternoon. And if you're on your way out, feel free to take some of that dessert because it needs to be enjoyed. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Ellis, for being here. We just really appreciate you here, what you're sharing.
Thank you. Okay, now the answers to the questions you never knew you had. Seventh-day Adventists and the movies. This comes from my dissertation research, which was completed in 2019, so you'll have an idea about when I was doing these studies. What did we think? Why did we think it? How have we related as a group of Christians to visual media over time? And it is about time that we asked ourselves some of these questions and thought about it, because as we've just been thinking about this entire day, we are inundated with media and visual media, and so it might be important to think about it. Before I do that, I have to back up because I was having such an interesting conversation with one of your doctor here who was chatting with me, a pediatrician, I think. And I have to mention to you that audio is different than visual media. Audio media is different than visual media. It's different with the brain. She was asking a question about listening to dramas like the Discovery Mountain or Your Story Hour or the Bible and Living Sound and those kinds of things, and if that's a different experience for the brain. It is. It's a very different experience for the brain. The imagination is in play and active. It's not the passive medium that visual is, where the picture's provided for you, everything's provided for you. It is indeed very different. So I just took away a huge amount of guilt for some of you. No, it's a good thing to do. Pretty right next door to reading, really. So yeah. Okay. There we go. This was the name of the dissertation, a historical and contemporary exploration of the conflict between Christianity and visual media. And in this research that I did, I was looking at two aspects, historical and now, current. So that meant it was really two separate types of research. One of them involved digging through documents from the past and finding the truth and searching it out. What happened? What conversations took place? Who were the thought leaders? Why did we think what we thought? How did people respond? Based on things that had been written. And then the second part of the research was interviewing 36 current Seventh-day Adventist Christians about, I don't want to go there yet, about their movie watching habits, thoughts, feelings, experiences, and how they were raised, and all those kinds of things to come to some kind of conclusion about where we are now. So first, let's go back and look and maybe answer the question on many of our minds a bit. 1880 to 1914 is the period when we were in really the developmental phase of film. The whole idea of moving pictures was being developed. It might go back a little further than you had thought. Really started moving pictures in 1880 were the first movies. And during this time period, for those of us who are Seventh-day Adventists, the most influential thought leader was likely Ellen White. And as some of us know, she never actually mentioned movies or the movie theater, even though she was alive until 1915? Yeah, 1915. She did not mention those things in her writing. So we don't know exactly what that means, other than perhaps as she was in her older years, this new technology was not something that was really on her mind or part of her experience. She didn't mention it specifically. She did talk about the theater, as in the live acting theater, where you would go to watch a theater production with live actors. She did say a few things, not as many as you might think, very few and quite rare, but she did say a few things about that. And they were mostly words of warning about the theater. The Ellen White statement from 1882 is likely the source of the angels won't go into the theater idea. Let me just ask, for those of you who have been raised Seventh-day Adventist, how many of you have heard that if you go into the theater, your angel won't go in there with you? And where did you think that came from? Ellen White, right? Okay, well, here is the only statement that goes that direction that she made, and I'm quite sure that this is where we got that idea, because you'll see why as we read it. A great responsibility rests upon the husband, house band, to bind the household together by the ties. Pleasure. Would my master be a guest at such a place? Will angels minister to me there? All right? Now, these are questions, aren't they? This actually doesn't say your angel won't go there, but I think our guardian angels are designed to be and given the commission to be with us all the time. That's my personal belief. But it does ask a series of really, really important questions that get at who we are as followers of Jesus, as followers of Christ. Would God put his blessing on this place I'm going? Would I be comfortable if Jesus was there with me? It's kind of like that WWJD. What would Jesus do? Would he feel comfortable here? Would my angel want to be there? Would that be a place my angel would feel comfortable? Worthwhile things. I like this statement actually because it's not really not talking about a place so much as it's talking about an attitude, about wanting to grow. Husbands, it's specifically to husbands. As you're guiding your family, put some thought into it. And all the topics we've been talking about today could fit right into what we're saying here. Being intentional, moving toward the kingdom in what we're doing. Now, the second period of time for the movies and for Adventists, 1915 to 1924, this was the early development of the film industry. And it was the time of production of silent films. So no talkies yet, silent films. This is when the first comments about moving pictures appeared in Adventist journals. We didn't say anything about them prior to this time. And here's one little quote from 1917. Everywhere, thinking men and women condemn in unsparing terms the increasing vulgarity of the films. And another one from 1919. We should shun enticing entertainment in the same way we speak against tobacco and liquor. So there were very strong statements during this period against the vulgarity that was taking place in the moving pictures. Now, let's go back a little bit. Let's see, 1924, that's before the production code of 1930. That I told you earlier read like a church manual. So this is prior to that. And the main place where films began was in places called the Nickelodeons, where you would put a nickel in and spin the pictures. There were actually flip cards, that's how it started. And then later, moving picture movies. But you go and pay your nickel and watch the girly show or the whatever titillating. They were pretty vulgar overall, and quite often. They weren't very tasteful, to put it minimally, okay? So a lot of these little films were not particularly wholesome. Some of them had nudity, etc. So no wonder that there was concern early on. I showed Charlie Chaplin there. He wasn't in that category, but 1925 to 1949 is the most interesting time period for this as it relates to Seventh-day Adventists. This is the time when a few elite Hollywood studios were in complete control of movie production. This is the big, what we call the studio era. This is Hollywood in the nostalgic sort of Hollywood way when we think about that. This is also, for the most part, we got a 5-year difference there, a time when the production code was in full effect. And so movies were not allowed to have kisses that lasted longer than 3 seconds. There could be no swear words. There could be no sexual dancing that might look like people might be attracted to each other. There just was a huge, you couldn't have nobody could not get their comeuppance if they did something bad. You had to show how they were punished for what they did within the film. In other words, the bad guys could never be good. There were a lot of other ones, but lots of things that made them, in essence, quite moral, although movie producers tried all kinds of ways of getting around those. But during this time, the writings of F.M. Wilcox, and that's him there, had a great impact on Seventh-day Adventists and their beliefs and practices related to movies, and I might add, their beliefs and practices related to almost everything. F.M. Wilcox, we could not underestimate as Seventh-day Adventists the influence of F.M. Wilcox. Editor of the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald for 33 years, from 1911 to 1944. The Adventism that our parents or grandparents knew was an F.M. Wilcox version of Adventism. He was very influential, and he wasn't a bad guy, but he was a very black and white sort of guy. There wasn't a lot of nuance for him. It's just the way he was in his writings, a little bit dogmatic, perhaps. And that Adventism that at least when I was growing up, was still kind of hanging on. I was born in the very end of the 1960s, and that sort of 1940s version of Adventism was pretty prevalent still. It's the one that my parents kind of came into. They became Adventists. And at the time, the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, or as we know it now, the Adventist Review, was read by everyone who was a church member, right? Everyone got their free copy in the mail. I think it was weekly back then. Yeah, every week. And they read it, too. And they believed it. It was doctrine. In 1926, Wilcox wrote an editorial titled A Warning Against Moving Pictures and Other Theaters. And in this article and successive articles over the next 15 years, Wilcox is the one who shaped a more rigid approach to movies. Very clear what was not okay. And basically, at first for Wilcox, no moving picture of any kind was okay. And then he softened a bit to say that there could be certain travel logs or science-oriented movies that might be okay. And he never really moved a lot beyond that position. He was unable to adapt to the changes in society post-World War I. I think I can say that. I'm sorry I don't have all. You need to read the whole dissertation to hear all the reasons why I make these statements about him, but he wanted the world to stay the same as it was before World War I. He knew Ellen White. He lived in the Edwardian era, the end of right after Victorian, the Edwardian era. So for him, the changes that came after World War I, where the world changed dramatically, society shifted in huge ways after World War I. We were no longer living Victorian/Edwardian life. We were in the industrial age. We were moving into the modern age. Soon came the Roaring Twenties, right? He did not know how the church could adapt to a more modern culture. He didn't know. Let me go back just for a second. The most startling, really the most interesting, I guess, to me, and most startling thing I learned in this dissertation was the influence of F.M. Wilcox. And if anyone would ask me, what was the big takeaway, out of that thing, that's a huge one for me, to realize how much influence he had on this and what he said and what he thought about this. And the General Conference did pass some initiatives about films that were really quite conservative at that time. Interestingly, he didn't say, nor did anyone else say at the time, that your angel wouldn't go with you into the theater. He didn't express that, but people could be disfellowshipped for having gone to one. And he did say that. He said very clearly, people who are going to the theater building should be disfellowshipped, just as if they had gone to the gambling place or something like that. So he was strong in his words. Wilcox died in 1949, but let's back up to this. 1950 to 1989 is the next kind of epoch that I look at as a particular, before another big shift came. And this was a change in the delivery of movies and other visual media. The change was television. Now, we have said we can't go into this place. Don't go to the theater or be disfellowshipped. Now what are we going to do? Because now the theater has essentially come into the house. This is the television. Wilcox died in 1949. He didn't live long enough to make warnings about television. I feel confident he would have. And maybe, despite the fact that I wish he wasn't so dogmatic, and he really frustrates me at points when I read some of the things he has to say and why he said them, maybe we would have at least more carefully examined television coming into our experience if he had been there to say something about it. But he wasn't, and he didn't. Televisions came into the homes of many Americans, including Seventh-day Adventists. People still avoided the theater building, but they watched movies and TV shows at home. And here is where we began the strange world of Adventists and movies. What in the world? We couldn't go to that building, but we could watch it at home. And then VCRs made it even stranger, because we brought the exact movies that were in the theater right into our house, even more, as long as you were willing to wait 3 months after they were released or whatever, that time window was. So there became a double standard. There certainly developed a double standard that left especially young people confused and frustrated. I'm one of those people. I'm that generation. I'm that generation that was a young person when the VCRs came to the home. I'm one of those people who went, what? What in the world? Thankfully, I didn't have to say what in the world quite as much as most of my peers, because my parents were raised Lutherans. They became Seventh-day Adventists, and so they were the ones, as I already told you, who said, let's not have a TV in our home, let's live real life. But once in a while in our Christmas stocking, there would be a little note that would say, 1 ticket to Pinocchio, 1 ticket to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 1 ticket to Bambi. And we would go to, guess where? The theater, and watch it. And my parents had no problem with that building. They couldn't understand what the building had to do with it. And so, on occasion, very rarely, obviously, and for a very special occasion, we would go to the theater building and see something. But there was no TV at home. And here was my best friend watching TV every night at home, but being sure that if she went into the theater building ever, it would be the end of her Christian experience. So there was very little written about this topic by church leaders. I don't know why. There was very, very little written about television, just a couple of things. And here it was, just coming right on in to the house. And not for the better, for the most part. There was someone who wrote about how it was keeping people from having time to read their Sabbath school lesson and study it. Fair enough. 1990 to the present is what I would call the digital age. And there has been a little more about it here and there, but not much. Myron Widmer, who was the editor of the Adventist Review during this time period, he did take up the topic in one article. And he suggested, rather than prohibiting attendance at a place, maybe the church should guide members to become discriminatory between the good and the bad in their watching habits. Yes, this is a new idea and a great one. A great idea. But very few have attempted to address or discuss how we should approach our mobile media age. Have you seen a lot written about it since 1990? Me either. I was asked to write one article in 2013, I think it was, for the Adventist Review, which side-skirted this issue a little bit. I got to touch on it a little bit, but they mainly wanted to talk about how God is in all forms of art and how films are a part of the world of art and how God is the one who gives us our artistic abilities, which I can agree with. But we didn't really talk about this topic in any kind of media literacy way, even in that article. So that leaves us now, and this is my observation as I've been a professor over the past 15 years roughly. The younger people that I'm meeting every day have no idea what to do with this. They've pretty much thrown all guidelines out, and it's kind of, for the most part, anything goes. All visual media is okay in any location. And I generalize, of course, but there's way too much of that attitude, in my view. And I feel like we need to go back to some thinking about what and when and how much. So I did do the contemporary in-depth interviews with 36 current Seventh-day Adventists, and very carefully, by their self-declaration, asking them, would you consider yourself traditional, moderate, or progressive? These were evenly divided amongst those three groups. So equal numbers of traditional, equal numbers of moderate, equal numbers of progressives, also equal number of male and female, and several ethnicities, and ages from 18 to 72 or 3 in those that I interviewed. Remarks related to the idea of angels not going to the theater were so frequent in these interviews that I gave that it became clear to me that this was a vivid image, very relevant to my study and leading me to do even more digging into that idea. So even with the youngest of the people I interviewed, they would say, well, my grandma believes, or I used to hear from my grandma or my aunt that. And they would still reference this idea, although the younger ones completely considered it nothing. There was a stigma about the movie theater that later didn't make sense to those who were watching movies and other visual media in other places. That became clear as they were talking with me. And it makes even less sense today with our smart TVs, laptops, tablets, and smartphones. The result has been this in talking with the people. There have been some extreme positions that people are taking. And there have been challenges for all of us in finding some sort of healthy spiritual perspective on the movies and other visual media. That's probably why I told God maybe this is 2016 or so, that Jeff Kinney asked me to give a presentation about this topic at the Village Church. And after that, after I had prepared it, I said, well, I'm a busy person and I'm a busy mom, so I'm not going out trying to get people to do this seminar, but if anybody asks me, this was just a little prayer, I'll just go and do it. And so that happens once in a while, not super often, but when it does, I go and do it because I think this is something we need to be thinking about, and we haven't thought about very well. So here's some perspectives that came from those interviews I did with people. There was, as you might expect when I'm interviewing even numbers of people who called themselves traditional, moderate, or progressive, I got a conservative perspective that came from a number of the people that I met with. And that perspective went kind of like this. They tended to address questions and concerns about the relationship between spiritual life and media choices throughout the entire interview. So and these were long, these were like 1.5 to 2 hour conversations with a set of topics and questions that I always covered with everyone, but we tried to keep it very conversational so that they could just share with me. And these were all recorded, audio recorded, and then transcribed later so that I could go through and study them and pick out themes that were occurring. And so those people who said that they were conservative and had a conservative perspective, they were all the way through the interview. These ideas about their spiritual life and their media choices were always coming up and always present as they were talking with me. Then there was a moderate perspective, and these people who said they were moderates were clear and thoughtful, almost always very clear and thoughtful about how their visual media choices related with their spirituality. They were thinking about it. They were talking about it with me throughout the interview at various places. Then there was a liberal perspective, and with those who said they were progressives or liberals, they generally and most often did not mention much of a connection between their spiritual life and the experience that they had with movies. They would just talk with me and answer my questions about the movies. And some said that the movies did not affect their spiritual life. So by the time I got to the ending part of these interviews, I would always hit right at those questions after we've had 1.5 hours to get to know each other, And then ask you, okay, so how do you think these experiences you've had with movies or the choices you make affect your spiritual life, if there's any connection? And those people would say that there really wasn't any effect at all. That was often I watch whatever, but it doesn't affect because I know who I am and these things I watch don't affect me. Or that they had separated the two in their thinking into two very, very separate different camps, that they weren't related. Actually surprised how many people would say to me that they're just two different things. Like, I have my spiritual life and I know what I believe, but what I watch has nothing to do with that at all. I did have one person who called herself a progressive who said, probably if I had more of that spiritual quiet time, I might make better choices. I think spiritual life, would have a lot to do with it. So some conclusions. Most Seventh-day Adventists seem to be mostly unaware of how the church came to its early understanding about movies. They don't have a history in their mind or a knowledge, and how and why some of the early admonitions have been adhered to so tenaciously. They don't know why we didn't go to the theater. They don't know why, when I was in high school at Auburn Adventist Academy in the 1980s, one of my classmates was suspended for going to a film during Christmas break. And I thought to myself, because I was the goody two-shoesest of them all. I'm an oldest child, and I'm just one of those keep the rules people. And I was such a good kid all through school. I was that teacher's pet kid, like kind of annoying. And I thought to myself, whoa, I could be suspended from school because I went to watch a movie with my family at Christmas. It was probably Bambi or something, but and it was a shock to me. Like, that could have been me. I could be one of the bad kids, doing something that I had been doing with my family. So we don't know. We haven't understood how that came to be or how we got to that way of thinking. Also, some conclusions from this study. The stigma of the evils of dramatic movies over other types of visual movies, okay? Dramatic movies, dramas, the movies. The stigma of those dramatic movies over other types of visual media, like documentaries, for instance, or television shows, for instance, has also bewildered some Seventh-day Adventist members. A lot of people talk to me about that, from various perspectives. Some people told me, we don't go to, we never, these are contemporary people, we never go to the theater, but we watch things on our laptop. But we never watch drama because drama is evil. But we watch other things on our laptop. So there's been some stigma of the evils of drama over other types of visual media. The reluctance of church leaders, I learned, to address these issues related to movies and other visual entertainment during the past several decades, and the delay in changing the wording of official admonitions in the church manual until 2010, despite dramatic changes in technology and practice, has left members confused and to a wide extent charting their own courses. Some have held tenaciously to the old admonitions, don't go to the theater. Some have tried to find a principle-based middle ground, and some have thrown out the old cautions entirely. That's kind of where we're at. And where was I going to tell you? Oh, yes, about the church manual. So until 2010, the church manual said the same thing it said back in F.M. Wilcox's day and in the early days about going into the theater was not something that a Seventh-day Adventist person would do. The building. It said that until 2010. It doesn't say that anymore. Now it has a much more comprehensive and cohesive statement about actually caring about what's going into our brains, what we're absorbing, and what would actually help us to grow in our spiritual walk versus not. So some thoughts, just a few thoughts for the future. Seventh-day Adventist members and institutions are in need of information about where they have come from and where we are now as a faith group related to visual media. Where are we? We don't talk to our children about this very much anymore. Now, I don't like the old way we talked to our children about it. It wasn't very healthy. Just don't go in that building. That didn't work, did it? But now we're just not talking about it at all. And I don't think that works either. They also need guidance. That's us, the church, need guidance about how they might relate with movies and other visual media in the future so that they might live faithfully and realistically in the mediated world of today. Somebody needs to be talking about it, writing about it. I'm trying to write about it. I took a sabbatical to work on a book based on this stuff. I've got, I think, 4 chapters out of 7, mostly there. But so you can pray for me that I'll have, number 1, time, and number 2, motivation. Yeah. Some thoughts for the future. There is a need for Seventh-day Adventists to understand the tools. This is an interesting one. Understand the tools used in visual storytelling. That's media literacy too. How do these things get put together? The techniques used to inform and to persuade, and the potential power of media and how it can affect individuals within a culture. If we understand how these things work, we, number 1, won't have to be as afraid of them, on one hand, and number 2, we can also be wiser about how we participate and how we consume. So rather than blindly avoiding or wholeheartedly embracing, members need to better understand how movies and other visual media work, and they need to approach them with discernment. And I think good discernment, or perspicacity, can only be found grounded in biblical concepts and grounded in a connection with God. So let's all pray for some God-given penetrating sight, a lamp to our feet and a light to our path, so that we'll be good at discerning what's really going on. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for the time we've had today to think about these things, to maybe reorient our thoughts. Most of all, we look to you. We look to you for wisdom, discernment, perspicacity, clarity, strength, the ability to come up with good ideas, creative ideas that will help us move ourselves and our loved ones in the direction of your kingdom. We don't want to be addicted. Instead, we want to be committed to you and focused on growing in your kingdom. And so we pray that you will do these things for us and that you'll give us the strength that we need. In Jesus' name, amen.
Dr. Ellis, thank you so much. We
Welcome,
really
thank you.
appreciate you coming up here and sharing with us. We appreciate your passion. And let's just let her know how much we do appreciate her, shall we? Yeah. That was very insightful and motivating. So thank you, thank you. And we will be praying for her to finish that book, right? To find the time. Oh, and if you have any other further questions, I'm sure she'd feel free to just stay here for a few minutes to answer. Okay, do you have any other questions that you wanted to raise and ask Dr. Ellis before we
Any about the
close
about
off?
the research, if you have any.
Yeah.
Don't have to.
Right here.
was going to say one observation. I remember the first time I was in a movie theater was going to an evangelistic meeting, and that felt funny.
Yes, yes. Like, what am I doing here?
My observation was I thought Adventists were kind of strange. I did not grow up in the Adventist church. And the idea of, you've got all of this media in your home, but it's taboo to walk through the theater doors to see Bambi or whatever. And it's, there was no explanation. It was just, you don't do it. Mm-hmm. And I think we've maybe taken that too far, maybe not in the last maybe few generations, but it seems like maybe we've said we don't do this, or this is how we raised our kids. You just don't do it, and we didn't give an explanation.
Yeah.
And that didn't work well either, so.
No, that didn't work. And I think that gets back to just really communicating, talking about these things, having reasons and sharing them, talking openly.
I think that one thing that we have to put on a prayer list, that's a weekly prayer list or whatever in the church, is praying for a hedge of protection around our young people.
Amen.
Because seeing lesbians and gays and stuff just on commercials is just becoming the new normal.
True.
And it's like Sodom and Gomorrah is just, that's just what we live in now. That's just what we see in the mall or in the street or on the TV, or it's not shocking anymore as it was when you saw it the first time.
Correct.
And I think our young people, that are now starting to watch TV or that's what they see from the start. It was never any different. And the addiction stuff, I've spoken to students before, and their phone pings and they pull out their phone while I'm talking to them, and I'm like, hey, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. And they're like, oh, sorry. It's so normal for us to just react or watch these things. And so I really think it's really hard to be a young person right now, growing up in this age of being shamed on Facebook, of a video
Yes.
going viral, of having to compare themselves in their image. That's rough.
So I don't know anybody else maybe who has children or grandchildren that age, young children or teenagers. You might have said to yourselves, why did we have kids in this era, in this world? My parents said that in 1968 when I was born. After my mom was pregnant, the world fell apart. Do you know 1968? There was a documentary called 1968, The Worst Year. I watched it. And I said, wait a minute, but I was born, after they were experiencing 1968, and they actually said to each other, what were we doing? We should have never had a child, this is terrible. And I've thought of that so many times because, the world that we birthed our children into is turning upside down. And trying to ground your children in biblical principles is hard when the world is modeling to them something else. Thank you. Yes, praying for them. Very important.
I just wondered if you had any brilliant suggestions to help young people who are going to college know how to interact and survive an isolated world. When my daughter was at college, she had an accident, and so I spent some time with her in her dorm. Mm-hmm. And I said, is there a home leave or something? It's dead here. Where is everyone? She's like, oh, everyone's watching stuff in their dorm rooms.
Yeah.
It was so lonely.
Yeah, and it was lonely before COVID, and it's really lonely during and since. Good advice. We're tackling those same things that you're talking about at Walla Walla University. There's very intentionally, we've been talking about how we can have more activities that students could be motivated enough to come out to do, where they could actually be together. We're really, the student life area, and we're really working on that. It's a huge challenge. We find that the girls are binging TV shows and the boys are playing video games, and to put generalities, and all night. And they're asleep in class sometimes. This isn't everybody, you guys, okay? But it's a lot of people. It's enough to be very concerning. So it's not being ignored as an issue, and we're trying to find things that will be interesting to them, that they'll want to be engaged with. This is a hard era. Our son is a sophomore at Walla University, and he has said things to us like, Mom, I don't know where to fit. I don't know how to fit. These are my values, and I can't find people that share these values with me. It's really hard. So for us, I think loving, and this is in our own personal case, right? Loving, encouraging, supporting, and trying to build spaces where I've made a little commitment, to have people over this year that are his peers, Last year, he was a freshman, and I wanted him to be, and I asked him a few times, should we? And this time I've just decided, I'm just doing it. I'm just inviting kids over. I know kids from class I teach there, They need to come over. I'm just inviting them over. And he might make friends with them or not, but they're coming over.
There's one thing that I've found that seems to be working with me. I've got 7 grandchildren I have influence with. All 5 of my boys are here and with wives. And this I apply to myself. By beholding, you become changed. Mm-hmm. And I was able to talk to my 3-year-old grandson and ask him, is that what you want to be? Because of what he was watching.
Yes.
And that seemed to cut through all of these things. If we can draw them out to what it is that they want, start making goals, and start looking at people that they could admire and follow.
So by beholding, we become changed, which we have been saying that, and we know that idea for a long time. And that's also Bandura's theory, his social modeling theory. That's it. We will become like what we observe. Yeah. Good plan. I like it. And I'm glad you have that opportunity with your grandkids too. That's awesome.
Hi, I just was wondering, as people are starting to introduce smartphones and other technology for their kids, do you have any recommendations or resources on different parenting controls or things like that to limit what they're exposed to, and even how to navigate some of that?
Yes, so I'm not much of an expert on those tools, but they certainly do exist. So I write off, I don't have like an app to recommend to you, but they do exist. And even though we haven't personally used them, mostly because they didn't have the phones until they were so much older, they can be very, very valuable. Any super smart technology kid will get around them, but little kids won't, and most people probably won't. Yeah, so I think they can be really helpful. I'm sorry I don't have a specific one to recommend, but that's a good idea. It's a good resource. It's a way to, especially when people are younger, have some ways to keep them, especially maybe even from accidentally coming across things that would be really harmful. Did you want to say something? I can just put my mic closer to you.
That doesn't mean you're going to be safe necessarily, even with those kind of controls.
That's true.
As we heard stories from friends of our kids at school, that in the computer lab, some of the smarter kids just taught everybody how to get around them.
Yeah.
So still be vigilant.
Yes.
I had a question. Is there something like an Adventist Hollywood? Is there a set of Adventist filmmakers that make movies sort of with Adventist themes in it? And if so, where would we look for that kind of genre?
Not yet.
But it's coming? Are you hinting that it's coming?
Okay, so there's a little bit of good news on this front. There hasn't been, and we as a church have been way behind in recent years, whereas back like 1951, we put out Faith for Today as a TV show. It was the first religious television show ever, period, and we did it. Right? Okay? So we were like, television, new technology, get there, make it. And there were even little drama segments on it. Get there and do that. William Fagel had the vision. I don't know what happened to us since then, but we lost that vision. And so where we are now is totally playing catch up with that sort of thing. There's a very large, as you know, Christian movie industry that's doing well and making money, and so therefore people are willing to support it. I mean, big companies outside. This whole thing that I just talked to you about Seventh-day Adventists, and we don't go into the theater, and we don't do drama, and we don't, has held us back as an organization from doing anything good with that either. It's been hard to find the money. It's been hard to find the support for it. So it's starting to turn. There's a Sunscreen Film Festival, S-O-N Screen, that the North American Division sponsors. It's been going actually 20 years now. But it was very small at first, very, very small. It's been probably in the past 7 years growing much more, and even just recently, even more. So that is there intentionally to support young filmmakers to do something good with their craft and to do something that the church could use to, lesser or greater effect, because some of those young filmmakers catch that vision. Most of them don't. They just want to make movies, but some of them catch that vision, want to do it. We had a master's degree at Walla Walla University. That's actually why they brought me to Walla Walla University, to begin with this master's degree in cinema, religion, and worldview, which was about combining the Seventh-day Adventist and the Christian worldview perspective with telling visual stories and doing that on the master's level. I'm totally biased, but it was a really great program. But when COVID came, we didn't have enough students, so it's not open anymore now. So, and we won't talk about that too much because you wouldn't want me to cry here. But that it's not presently open, but there are things, in other words, the church is starting to take some steps toward trying to make that happen. We have a long way to go. We really have a long way to go. We still have a long way to go with conferences. One of the reasons why the master's degree didn't thrive the way it needed to was that we couldn't get conferences to sponsor people to come to it, like ministers and communication directors and those sorts. There were a couple exceptions, but for the most part. So the long answer to your question, it doesn't currently exist in the way we would love to see it, but there are individuals moving in that direction. There are organizations that are trying to move it in that direction so that we can really have a voice. We can really tell stories effectively. We have the most amazing message to share. And we have to wake up and realize that we have to share that message in a way that people can access. By that I mean the language they're used to speaking, the visual language they are used to speaking. And anybody under the age of 50 these days expects maybe everybody, even, I don't know, of just about any age, okay, expects their visual media stuff to be top-notch. We want it to look good. It has to be super high quality, or we just don't spend our time with it, I think, at any age. And definitely that's the case with Gen Z. So, I've talked straight up with my kids. I'm like, would you watch something like this? Would you watch something like, no, if it's not at that quality, we're not interested. So we have a really high calling and something that we need to do as a church that we aren't really doing effectively yet.
Speaking about Oliver again, I made him promise to listen to you at least for the first sermon. So he sat down with me on the couch and we listened to your presentation, and I kept engaging him, making sure that he's listening. He's super smart. Mm-hmm. And he said, you know what? This is really exciting me because I can foresee my future making Adventist films great.
Aha, yes.
He would be one that would be really excited to learn how to make film with an Adventist bent to it, definitely.
We're kind of proud of our grandson, Oliver.
That's good.
There was an interaction that he had. We were coming back from Orlando, and he met his kindergarten teacher there who was dropping off her daughter to university there in Orlando. And she was very inquisitive about how he was doing and asked him what game he was playing on his little Switch thing. And he said, oh, it's about this planet, and they've got these old mechanized things, and we've got to go in there with an arrow or an axe, and we got it. And she goes, oh, well, why mechanized and engineering, and why would you go in there with such antiquated tools and stuff? He goes, well, because it's back 100 years ago they were. And anyways, there was this whole backstory, and this guy who was like 30 years old, he says, that kid's got it right on. I played that game too. So it goes to a wide age thing. And I'm thinking, because there's always backgrounds to these gaming, and why can't you have a kid studying to be in the Olympics, and they're going to Babylon, and Daniel's there, and they're about to have the Olympic Games, and all of a sudden they play all these musical instruments, and these three guys get thrown in a fiery furnace.
Yes.
I mean, you can involve that in these stories of gaming.
I think that's actually the next sort of frontier that's going to happen with that kind of game development. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions. Well, one that just came up. That kind of content that you're talking about, that, you know, it's something positive like that, does that somehow do something different to the brain? Or like the gaming, you know, isn't it the
Yeah. So
stimulus?
while he's talking, I'm thinking about that too, because it's yes and no. It's kind of the same thing with, you know, when, like I said, when we're watching the movies, we need to be watching movies that we feel good about the messages they're giving, because we know we're turning off part of our brain kind of, and the other part's coming on. And they're very influential, so I'm all for making good influential stuff. But also with the gaming, we must keep in mind, no matter what kind of game we develop, that video gaming is addictive. It is.
But they're going to watch it, they're going to play it anyway, so.
It would be better for sure. It would be better for sure. And you might be able to reach out to someone who you might not find anywhere else.
Yeah. So 2 questions, if I may. One is, in your research about the history of Adventists and movies, did you find that same phenomenon was going on to some extent among any other Christian denominations?
Oh, yes, so glad you asked that, because that is in the long paper, but it's not what I said today. Yes. So this you will find interesting. Any of you know your Adventist history a bit? Yes. All Christians were concerned at first about moving pictures, to some extent, and many groups very concerned. They just didn't stay there as long as we did. They moved much more quickly. And the most conservative of all of those groups related to visual media, with what they have written, and there's even a document from this church, is the Methodist Church. And that shouldn't surprise, Ellen White came out of the Methodist movement. So that wouldn't surprise us, right? That even though she didn't write about movies particular, but that her background, where she came from, would be the group who would express these things the most clearly, their concerns about it. So no, we were not alone. We just stayed there for about 40 years longer than everybody else, or more. I don't know. I'm not too good at math. Way, way longer. Okay.
Right. The second question is one that I hesitate to ask, and so don't answer if you don't feel like answering it. But I understand that a few years back, there was an initiative and a production of a film by young adults in the church about the Great Controversy,
Yes.
and it got defunded, shut down.
Yes.
Anything you want to share about that? Because when I hear something like that, it's like, okay, that's a real motivator to,
That was very painful for many young people.
I bet.
It was called The Record Keeper, and it was a version of the story of the Great Controversy done as a steampunk. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, you imagine sci-fi Victorian. So it's the Victorian era. Everybody's clothes and things look. Think Jules Verne. Does that help at all? No? Okay, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne. Okay, so you've got mechanical devices that do amazing things, but they kind of look like they're from the Victorian era. That's steampunk. So that was the genre that the creatives this was a great team of Garrett Caldwell, who used to be in this conference, by the way. He and he is the communication guy from the church, and these creatives got together. They're like, how could we tell this story in a really engaging way? And because we're dealing with angels. I mean, angels are characters in this story. And they're talking about the controversy and the fall and everything, and how could we do this in a way that would really work? And so they chose steampunk as the genre to do it in, because they didn't want to have angels with fake wings and long skirts and flowing white robe. They were like, that's just not going to work. It's not going to be believable. So let's just go kind of outside of all that and try to portray it this way. So they did. I've watched. Oops, don't touch my mic. I might have a sort of clandestine copy of that at home. But anyway, so I've watched it, and it was very creative. In my opinion, it was true to the story of the great controversy. It had beautiful biblical themes in it that were really deep. And lots of students, at the time it came out, I was teaching at Southern, and lots of students in the film department there were involved in that production in one way or another. And when it got defunded, there was definitely pain and angst, for sure. Some of the professors, we tried to share with them the idea that, this isn't foreign for what happens in the field you're going into, whether it's in the church or outside of the church. Many projects get made, many pilots for television get made, and they're wonderful, and they're told they're going to get picked up. And then when the season actually begins, some other executive comes in and makes a decision, which is pretty much what happened here, and then it's just done. And it's gone and it's dead and nobody ever sees it. It happens all the time. So we tried to tell them, this isn't just a church problem. This is how it is in the world of, releasing these things. I hope that helped. It is a truth, and hopefully it helped their perspective. But this wasn't going to be for everybody. This wasn't intended for all of us who have a really biblical way of looking at the world and think of angels as real. And it wasn't intended for those of us who have this story already. It was intended for people who've never heard this story, and as a way for them to begin to access the story and then maybe order themselves a copy of The Great Controversy when it came up at the end of the show. So, yeah.
Didn't The Sound of Freedom have the same kind of thing? It
Oh,
stayed
man.
on the shelf for 5 years before anybody picked
That's
it
right.
up. No.
Sound of Freedom, you've heard of that big money-making movie that lots of people tried to keep from getting to the theater? Yeah. Yes, and the church, let me just say, this is an opinion, but church executives and pastors who have been moved into executive positions, I love pastors, but should stop making the decisions about how visual content should look. For instance, have you all seen Tell the World? So it's pretty good, but it's not as good as it was before the non-creative executives decided that it was going to be cut differently and longer and different. And it's all the same footage, but it's just not edited correctly, and it's not edited well. But I have great news. Kyle Portbury, who directed it, who was the only Seventh-day Adventist on the entire production crew, because that's how it goes, they hired people who could do these and actors who knew how to act, and he was the only Seventh-day Adventist there as the director. And he wrote it and directed it. No, he didn't write it. He had another writer. He wrote the overall concept. And then, they made this thing, and then it got really messed up in post-production. But it got released to us anyway, and it's pretty good. But it could be a lot better. Well, the director's version of this is being re-released by Hope Productions, which is related with the Hope Channel. It's being re-released by them with the intro that was originally supposed to be on it and the narrative structure that it's supposed to have. And it's a little shorter in length overall, but better storytelling, is going to be released into theaters. I think it's next spring. It's either February or April. I can't remember which. And it's called The Hopeful. So watch for a movie to come out in regular theaters called The Hopeful. Okay, and I might have just told you something I'm not supposed to be talking about yet, but anyway. Just watch for it, okay? It's called The Hopeful, and it's going to be the Seventh-day Adventist story in regular theaters with the original cut the way it was supposed to be by the director. Wow. Next spring, I think. Maybe it's even sooner. I'm trying to. I've heard the release dates on several things recently, and I might be getting them confused. The earliest it will be is December. Just watch for it. Okay. So, The Hopeful is the new name. You can. Daniel wants to know if you have permission to go to the theater to see it. I'll leave that up to you. You're still confused. I'll leave that up to you individually.
I will be passing out indulgences at the door.
Perfect. Perfect.
Or dispensations, whichever you wish.
Very good. Well, thank you, you guys. Really appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it. Yes. And Rob, is there still some dessert waiting to be taken? Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.